Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the Survive podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Frank Hughes. And today we're discussing why Frank believes in Markan priority. So it's good to have you back on the show, Frank.
It's certainly my pleasure.
Can you tell us a little bit about why you believe in Markan priority before we get into the slides?
Well, yes, I think that those of us who have taught the New Testament and particularly taught the Gospels, we are very, very familiar with helping students, look in the synopsis of the Gospels. And I use Kurt Allen's synopsis of the four Gospels. We all use the same one, so I can say, look at section, look at number 136. So basically, this is the way I teach the Gospels and taught when I was teaching at Codrington College for 6.5 years. Well, basically, certainly more than 90%, I believe more than 90% of biblical scholars believe that Mark is the first of the three synoptic Gospels to have been written. And for a long time, the church taught otherwise because they were following Augustine, who said that Mark was the abbreviator and the lackey, the sort of petty sequus, the foot follower of Matthew. And so pretty much everybody believed that until 1838. And then in 1838, independently of each other, Christian Hermann Weisse came up with Markan priority, and also at the same time, the same year, but independently, Christian Gottlob Wilke, who knew a lot of work, by the way. He also argued in favor of Markan priority. In general, the general belief is the argument from order. And the idea is when you compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, either in the synopsis or in Alan Barr's wonderful diagram of synoptic relationships, you can see that there are only about 30 verses out of over 600 verses of Mark. Only about 30 are not reproduced reproduced in some way in Matthew and Luke, or Matthew or Luke. Also, Matthew and Luke are longer than Mark. Luke, by the way, is the longest document in the New Testament. So also, when you look at Matthew and Mark, either Mark has to be first or Matthew has to be first. I think that goes without saying. And so it's either your only real choices that make any sense at all are Matthean priority, in other words, that Matthew was first, and Markan priority. With Matthean priority, you have a much longer gospel, and yet when Matthew looks at Mark's miracle stories, Matthew abbreviates them and gets rid of some of the gory details, some of the more the details that might detract attention from the teaching of Jesus. Also, Matthew tends to edit out some of the Latinisms and Aramaisms that Mark preserves. Also, Matthew and Luke are widely thought of to be in better Greek than Mark is in. Also, as I believe, Mark has a kind of an unremitting attitude toward the apostles, that the apostles are really pretty much schmoes. I mean, they just, there are only two problems with the apostles. They're unfaithful and they just don't get what Jesus is saying much of the time. And that is the overall attitude of the Gospel of Mark about the apostles. Whereas in Matthew, the apostles are students of Mark, And, one of the things that happens in the tradition of students and teachers in the ancient world is when the teacher dies or when the teacher is taken away, the students become the new teachers. And so Matthew wants to make it clear to the readers of that gospel that the apostles are very worthy teachers of the church because they remembered what Jesus said and they teach the people in their time what Jesus said when Jesus was in his natural life. And so, on with a combination of factors, the order of Mark versus the order of Matthew, um, and uh, the differences in language between Matthew and Mark, and also the differences in um, the uh, the presentation of the apostles. When you add those three together, um, I do get the very strong impression that Mark was first, and Mark was used as a written source in substantially the same form that we have it today. But Mark was used as a written source by Matthew and was used as a written source by Luke, too.
All right, let's get to the slides. So, what can you tell us a bit about the Jesus and oral tradition?
Well, yes. In other words, Jesus had to have taught something. And Jesus, in fact, taught that he taught about the center of his teaching, as far as I believe, and as far as Mark understands it, the center of Jesus' teaching is the kingdom of God. And so during Jesus' lifetime, people heard his teaching and were very taken by it. And then they remembered his teaching after his death, and as I believe, his resurrection. I believe that he was resurrected from death, and that is the impetus for why the church, did its thing after Jesus' death. So the first stage is the oral stage, and the oral stage included both the words of Jesus, his teaching, and also different words about the things that Jesus did. And in Mark, you have miracle stories up one side and down the other, actually 24 miracle stories. And so as a result, um, people in the people that were in the communities of faith that the apostles established in different places around the empire, they remembered what the apostles taught them that Jesus said and that Jesus did. And then eventually um, these teachings got written down. And a big impetus for the teachings to be written down was, well, my God, the apostles, well, they just keep dying on us. The earliest writings by Jesus followers were Paul's letters. And in Paul's letters, Paul uses the term gospel, evangelion, quite a few times. And he never, ever, not even once, uses the term gospel to mean a written document, i.e., like a life of Jesus or a biography of Jesus. And so St. Paul does not know or does not cite the teachings of Jesus. And so one may presume that Paul does not have access to that. By the way, that may be one of the critiques about Paul, um, that Paul does not really have a real connection with the Jerusalem apostles. The opponents of Paul in Second Corinthians apparently carried around letters of recommendation, um, and one can certainly guess that letters of recommendation that the opponents of Paul carried were probably something like kind of like a written guarantee or a written warranty that the bearer of this letter has the full approval of the Jerusalem church. We're not told that when Paul attacks the other apostles for carrying around letters of recommendation, but Paul would not bring up the issue of letters of recommendation in 2 Corinthians unless his opponents were carrying around letters of recommendation and claiming to have authority on the basis of them. So anyway, the other apostles probably do have some information, some more information than Paul has about what Jesus did and what Jesus said. Robert Jewett, my teacher, calculated the death of Paul in the year 62 CE. If you follow the early church tradition that Paul died during the time that Nero was the emperor, that's a pretty good date. So by the 60s, if not earlier, and certainly later, the apostles are dying. And so since the apostles are dying, people in these Jesus communities are wanting to know who it is they're following. They're wanting to know what he taught. They're wanting to know what he did. And so they remembered it from what the apostles taught them, and they wrote it down. And the first one to do it, as far as we have evidence, as I believe, was Mark. And of course, the Papias fragments tell us that Mark was written from the reminiscences, memories of Peter, and that Mark was not necessarily written in the order of the way things happened in the life of Jesus, but he wrote it down in the way that Peter remembered it and told it. So Papias, as quoted by Eusebius in Book 3, Chapter 39, knows that Papias knows that the writer of the Gospel of Mark was not an eyewitness of or an ear witness of the teaching of Jesus. So in other words, it started with oral tradition and then it continued. And can we go to the next slide? Yes. And so in the middle to late first century, the oral tradition as to what Jesus said and did had been floating around in oral tradition in different churches, probably in different ways. And it was collected and compiled, and it became the core of Mark and then later Matthew and Luke. And it's a pretty reasonable assumption that the oral tradition was different in different cities, different regions, and different times. And of course, the reason that it was different is that's what was spreading around. And of course, one of the reasons why you'd want to write it down would be to preserve it, but also to some extent to control it. And so if we could have the next slide, I'll show you my picture. If you look at the left-hand top of that slide, Jesus probably did know biblical Hebrew, but the likelihood is that his oral language, the oral language he spoke and the language that the people in Galilee understood was the Western dialect of Aramaic, Palestinian Aramaic. And then, so after his death, then the apostles started creating ecclesiae, churches, congregations. And then at some point, the teaching of Jesus made the jump between Aramaic and perhaps other languages too, but especially it made the jump to Hellenistic Greek. And this, of course, Hellenistic Greek was important because the Old Testament had been translated into Hellenistic Greek. And 3/4 of the quotations of the Old Testament in the New Testament come from that Septuagint, that translation of the Hebrew Bible into Hellenistic Greek. So You got Greek-speaking churches, originally Aramaic-speaking churches. Then you got Greek-speaking churches, especially around the Mediterranean Sea. These Greek-speaking churches are the ones that really caught on, especially because of the ministry of Paul. And so they create narratives about Jesus' deeds. And we're still at the oral stage. And then you go to the left, and then you see then these various narratives about Jesus, what he said and what he did. They're collected and they're extensively edited. And this is where Matthew and Luke edit Mark. And then you can see those 5 or 6 arrows pointing to the right, and they're different arrows with different shapes and different colors. The editing takes place in different places and in different ways. Matthew and Luke certainly edit Mark in different ways. And then these sayings, which were originally oral, probably during the green stage, they probably got to be written. And then editing went on, and then they became the Gospels. Okay. Now, if we can have the next slide, you have a Streeter type solution to the synoptic problem. I admit I don't have Proto-Luke and all of that stuff, but you have the two source theory, which if you add M and L, you got this 4 source theory. This is what I taught my students. And so we call it the 2 source theory because Mark and Q are the sources for Matthew and Luke. And then M represents other material that's not in Mark and not in Q that finds its way into Matthew. And then L represents stuff that's not from Q and not from Mark that finds its way into Luke. As far as Q goes, I would say about 4 days a week I believe in Q, and about 3 days of the week I don't believe in Q. And my problem with Q is I don't know what it was. I know Mark is a written source. I know Matthew is a written document. I know Luke is a written document. But as far as what Q was, you can accept it as a source for about around 230 verses in Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. But as far as going beyond that, I have doubts as to what it was. I don't really know whether it was oral or whether it was written. And the doubts that I have about Q have to do with you have Q material in Matthew and you have Q material in Luke, if the theory is correct. And yet the Q material in Matthew is in a different order than the Q material in Luke. Most of the people who believe in Q, and I guess this includes me 4 days a week, most of the people believe that the more primitive form of Q is preserved in Luke rather than in Matthew. And when we look at Matthew and we look at what Matthew does to Mark, we know that Matthew is very willing to change a word here, a word there, fix a verb here, fix a sentence there, smooth something out that's in Mark. Whereas when Luke uses Mark, Luke loves to use big blocks of material from Mark. And then he has the travel narrative in Luke 9:50 through Jesus getting to Jerusalem in chapter 18. You have this long travel narrative from the latter part of chapter 9 into chapter 18, where there is very, very little Markan material. So Matthew, in using Mark, likes to slice and dice. And Luke, in using Mark, likes to use big blocks of material. So that's one of the ways that that confirms for me Markan priority. So anyway, was there anything? Yeah, we had a couple of more. You had the next one. I think the problem with this diagram with, the 4 source theory or the 2 source theory is that students could come to two too easy a recognition, too easy a belief that everything is written sources. And if you look at the next slide, you see that over and above any written sources are oral tradition, which is different in different places. And so just because you get the Gospel of Mark written, and just because there might be maybe is uh, a written collection of Jesus sayings in Q, mostly sayings material, although not all of it, that doesn't mean that the oral tradition died. The oral tradition of the teaching of Jesus was still alive and well even after the Gospels were written, as I would date them in the late first century. So the written tradition of the words and deeds of Jesus did not kill the oral tradition. The oral tradition and the written tradition existed side by side for a while. So let me see. If you can skip the next slide and then go on to the last one. Markan priority is a scholarly theory that Mark was the written source, not merely oral, but a written source for Matthew and Luke. And so if you look at Alan Barr's diagram of synoptic relationships, you can see that, you have Mark, and then you can see from the arrows going to the left and to the right of what is picked up from Mark, and you see it, and it appears in Matthew and Luke. And one of the things that has been noted by Streeter and others is that if assuming Markan priority, when Matthew deviates from the order of Markan material that is in Mark, when that same material is picked up in Luke, Luke preserves the Markan order, and vice versa. So one of them, either Matthew or Luke, but usually both, preserve not only Markan material, but they also preserve it in the Markan order. And so that is the argument from order that I admit everybody doesn't agree with.
So when you say earlier that you believe in Q 4 times a week and 3 times a week you don't, do you wonder if Luke might have known Matthew or vice versa?
Well, yeah, but if Luke knew Matthew and Luke has this material that's not in Mark, given that Luke preserves the Markan order most of the time, and he preserves the order especially because he uses big blocks of material, then a reasonable expectation, I think, would be that Luke would take the material. If Luke used Matthew as a source, wouldn't it be appropriate for Luke to preserve the order of this Matthean material? It would be in the same order in Luke as you see it in Matthew. If Luke used Matthew as a source, why would he abbreviate why would the author of Luke abbreviate the Sermon on the Mount so much? So if Luke used Matthew as a source, or Matthew used Luke as a source, although I think in light of the preface of Luke 1:1-4, I am not inclined towards Lucan priority by any means. But if Luke used Matthew as a source, you would rather expect that Luke would preserve more of the Matthean order than Luke seems to preserve of the material commonly accounted as part of Q. So I think the argument from order is important. I don't think that you can discount the argument from order, either in favor of Markan priority or in favor of the existence of Q.
So I'm gonna add what you sent me in the Word format.
Right. That
As
parallel.
another slide. Yeah. I'm setting that up right now. Oh, there we go. Almost there. All right, here we are.
Yeah. Okay. I understand that Gospel Parallels, edited by Burton Throckmorton, is in the public domain now, but I don't think that Kurt Allen's synopsis, which is the one that I use all the time, is. And so I put together this for people that I was teaching over in Monroe and over in Shreveport. And you can see that I've put it in the order Matthew, Mark, Luke. And you can see that in Mark 2, 1 through 12, you have a very fulsome narrative about the healing of the paralytic. And you can see Matthew abbreviating some of the details of the state of the paralyzed man. He omits the details of his friends are four of his friends are carrying, and they have to bore through the roof to get to him. So there's nothing about them boring through the roof, and there's nothing about. It says they presented to him a paralytic who lay upon a bed, but it doesn't say that there were four of them, as they were in Mark. But anyway, Luke preserves the idea that they have to bore through the roof. Matthew does not. And then you have a more skeletonic miracle story in Matthew 9, 1 through 8, because Jesus, seeing their faith, in other words, the faith of the people is a really important thing for Matthew. That's a big deal. And then he says, cheer up, child. Your sins are forgiven you. And then instead of the more of the conversation of the Pharisees or the scribes that you see in verse 6 of Mark and you see in verse 21 of Luke, you just have one scribe says to another, or some of the scribes saying, hey, he's blaspheming. And so Jesus responds to them and asks them a question, very rabbinic, which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and walk? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on the earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, get up, carry your bed, and return to your home. And so then he got up immediately. Immediately is a big Markan word. Carrying his mat, he exited in front of them all, and all the crowd was amazed and glorified God, saying, we've never seen anything like this. And then the direct discourse or the direct conversation of the crowd that sees it is in Luke and in Mark, but Matthew does not put that in there. So that shows you a pretty typical Matthean editing of a Markan miracle story. Of course, the mother of all Matthean editing of Markan miracle stories is in Mark 5:1-20 with the healing of the Gerasene demoniac, which is in Matthew 8:28-34, where almost all of the gory details of how sick and crazy this man is edited out. And Luke edits it out a lot less. But anyway, you can see that Matthew and Luke, but especially Matthew, is not at all afraid to rework Mark's narrative. In other words, Christians love to look at somebody else's text, and then they had a lot of respect for Mark because they preserved Mark. Mark is the skeleton of Matthew and Luke, but they preserved it, but they were also very willing to edit it, as indeed they did.
So basically, what you're saying is that Matthew and Luke, in somewhat different, maybe different ways is the wrong way of putting it, but sort of something like that. They're taking Mark material and Q material and organizing it in slightly different ways.
I would say slightly different ways, and now and then very different ways. Certainly, the Markan handling of the apostles is, as I believe, quite consistently negative. And in Matthew, that is edited right out. And the apostles, they are the teachers of the church. They are the next generation of the teachers when Jesus leaves, when Jesus departs. The new guys that are going to tell you about what God is like and what you're supposed to believe and how you're supposed to act, yada, yada, yada. The apostles are traveling evangelists and church planters. And that's exactly what they do. So yeah, I think in some ways it's very different.
Since you find a great difficulty in Luke possibly, or in the idea of Luke possibly using Matthew, when you doubt Q, how would you explain Matthew and Luke's double tradition material if Q is not a written document, nor that Luke used Matthew, or vice versa?
Well, remember that slide that we had that had oral tradition at the top?
Yes.
The oral tradition at the top. In other words, if you have Mark and Q, those are two sources you can identify. And the fact that you can identify two sources or one source, the fact that you can identify source A and source B does not gainsay the idea that there was also source C and source D and source E and so forth. And the other thing is that there is some material in Luke, for example, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man in Luke, what is it, 16:19-31. In my article on the story of Lazarus and the rich man, I looked at the older ideas of Hugo Gressmann. Gressmann believed that there were Aramaic gospel books standing behind Luke, for example. But of course, no one has identified what that was. And so, when you identify a source, it'd be great if you could say what kind of source it is, and if you could kind of give some evidence for that source's existence. And so when I wrote that article, which I presented in London in 1995, I could not identify a source for Luke 16:19-31, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. And so I argued that it was, in fact, a Lucan composition. But like I say, at least 4 days a week, maybe 4.5 days a week, the Q hypothesis gives me some confidence that Luke got this material from earlier tradition. I don't think that any of us would want to argue that Luke wrote everything down from scratch in the late first century. That doesn't seem likely at all.
And do you have an opinion on if everything attributed to, all the sayings attributed to Jesus in the Q document was spoken by the historical Jesus?
Well, I don't really have any objection to them as coming from the historical Jesus. Um, Jesus was a really pithy teacher, and I think that there probably are some things in Thomas, for example, that might very well come from the historical Jesus. Most notably, that wonderful saying, "He who is close to me is close to the fire, and he who is far from me is far from the kingdom." Now, you won't find that in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and you will find it in Thomas. But it does, in fact, look like a saying that Jesus could very well have said. That kind of pithy, penetrating saying that causes you to think, okay, what is God like? And if God is like this, what have I got to do about it? So I think that it's kind of like the agrapha, the unwritten sayings of Jesus, collected by Alfred Resch, the famous book Agrapha. And of course, one of them is in the book of Acts, where the apostle said, "Remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he said, 'It is more blessed to give than to receive.'" Well, you're not going to find that in the Gospels either. So, given a very extremely robust oral tradition, it's not hard to believe that there would be a variety of ways that sayings of Jesus could have been transmitted, and that they would eventually find their ways into the written Gospels that we have, and some of them would be lost. For example, in Paul in 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul says, "I wrote you not to associate with immoral people." And he says that in the aorist tense, a past tense. And so, unless you're willing to say this is the epistolary aorist, as a friend of mine does, if letter B, according to our partition theory, if letter B is not the letter against porneia, then the letter referred to in 1 Corinthians 5:9 is lost. And then in 2 Corinthians 2:4, he says, "I wrote you out of much anguish of heart and with many tears." And then he describes the in the rest of chapter 2 and part of chapter 7, he describes the reception of the letter which he wrote with much anguish of heart and with many tears, and how it produced such a reaction in the Corinthian church. And so if 2 Corinthians 10, 11, 12, and 13, possibly with 1 Corinthians 9, 1 through 18, in other words, our letter F, if that is not the letter referred to in 2 Corinthians 2:4, then the letter of tears is lost. So it does make sense that, given that a lot of oral teaching activity was going on, it does make sense that some unknown amount of oral teaching of Jesus would very likely have been lost. And so we should not claim to have all of it. We know we don't have all of Paul's teaching. So I think that you have to read the sources very carefully and try not to say more than you know.
And when would you say this Q source was either written, or if it was not written but oral, when did it start spreading then, circulating by word of mouth?
I think given, let's assume that Q exists. After all, it's Monday. I guess we can assume Q exists. Um, um, if Q exists, it was probably being circulating, given that most of it is teaching material, is sayings material, and is not parables. You do have some material about the temptations of Jesus, and you have some stuff about the John the Baptist in Q. I can't see any reason why anyone would deny that it would be very early material, going back to the 30s, going back to the 40s. Paul is writing his letters and in the 50s, and this teaching material from Jesus and miracle stories from Jesus simply do not find themselves anywhere in the Pauline letters. So all we can say is this material could have been circulating as early as the 30s and 40s and 50s. And of course, it might have circulated orally for decades before it ever got written down as a written document that we refer to as Q. So, in other words, just as there probably were stages of the written Gospels, they didn't happen all at once. You can surmise or theorize that an oral collection, or a primarily oral collection, could have put together sayings of Jesus coming through from different apostles and through different churches, and that there's no reason to believe that had to happen all at once, or that it would be all from one church in one city. So I think it happened over a period of time, and I cannot commit myself to any particular location for Q.
And when would you date Mark? Would you put it right after the destruction of the temple or shortly before it? When would you put it?
I have been teaching for years that Mark is that I think the destruction of the temple preceded Mark, and that the words of Jesus, where the disciple asks him, "Well, see what big stones and what big marvelous buildings there are," and Jesus says, I think it's in the beginning of chapter 13 of Mark, and Jesus says, "I tell you, there will not be one stone left on top of another stone." It depends on if you think that does go back to the historical Jesus, or if you think that is ex eventu prophecy, or a vaticinium ex eventu. And I opt for the latter, that it is ex eventu prophecy, where by the time Mark is written, the Jewish war has happened, and the destruction of the temple has happened, and that the writer of Mark is aware of that, and he places that in the mouth of Jesus in Mark 13 to give verisimilitude to Mark, in that Jesus is in Jesus' earthly life, he's prophesying the destruction of the temple. So I regard that as a prophecy that is ex eventu, and so if you do that, that allows you to date the Gospel of Mark after the destruction of the temple rather than before it. But I admit that it could have gone back to the historical Jesus. Jesus could indeed have prophesied the destruction of the temple. So I believe Raymond Brown's intro to the New Testament, he says 65 to 75, give or take 5 or 10 years. So he is very non-committal on that. So the dating of Mark depends definitely on how you interpret that saying of Mark about one stone not being left on top of another. But for years, I certainly have taught that Mark is after 70. And then that would mean that Matthew and Luke are after that.
And how far after that would you place them?
Well, I don't think that we really know, but I would say it wouldn't be surprising if it were a decade or a decade and a half or a couple decades. Long enough for the writer of Matthew or the writer, author, editor, compiler of Matthew and the author, editor, compiler of Luke, who says that he gets stuff from eyewitnesses and also ministers of the word, preachers, long enough for Mark to be in circulation in some way or another. In other words, if you believe in literary dependence of Matthew and Luke on Mark, then Mark needs to have been written and Mark needs to have been circulated in some way. Of course, just because Matthew and Luke seemingly had copies of Mark, that doesn't mean that everybody else in the Christian world did too.
Well, thank you for joining me. Thank you for joining me today, Frank.
Well, my pleasure. I was hoping we would see some people in the chat, but nonetheless, I'm sure there will be some chat after you post it. As you know, I have completed a little book on Mark for regular people, people who are, my parishioners or other people's parishioners. And it's about between 50 and 60,000 words. And it's at the publisher now. It's about to be copy edited. And then I have just put together a book proposal for a medium-sized commentary on Mark, which I estimate between 300 and 400 words, 400 pages. And as far as that goes, in terms of writing the big commentary on Mark, should that happen, I'm still at really early stages of that. And I feel that I can't really write on Mark until I really do a lot more exploring in what the earlier scholars said about Markan priority and the relationship between Mark and Jesus and so forth. And so, I'm interested in what Heinrich August Wilhelm Meyer said, and I'm interested in what Henry Barclay Sweet said. Ferdinand Christian Bauer also wrote a monograph on Mark. And then Johannes Weiss wrote a book on Mark called The Earliest Gospel, Die Ältesten Evangelium, which I'm so pleased that it's reprinted and you can read it. So I'm still at early stages of research for writing a big commentary on Mark. And one of the features of this commentary, if the publisher agrees, will be kind of a survey of 25 or 30 commentaries on Mark going back to Meyer. So, we'll see. So I've become a busy person again.
Yeah, certainly looking forward to that coming out. But yeah, when I look at the live chat, from what I can make out, it's mostly just they're mostly just interacting with each other. I don't see any. I can't tell it's a question directed to you. But anyway,
I can't see anything in the chat. But anyway, maybe there's a comments. Oh yeah, there's some comments. Well, in any event, yeah, I see they are interacting with each other. Yeah. Well, these are interesting issues. And Markan priority is an essential issue if you're trying to reconstruct. I mean, I think your choices are either Markan priority, which I favor, and which most people do favor, or Matthean priority, and the existence or the non-existence of Q, or something like Q, whatever Q was. This is an issue that we have to deal with.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Frank.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And we'll talk later.
Yep, sounds good.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel.
Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.